From the PSIA-AASI satellite studios in Corvallis, Oregon, I'm George Thomas, outclassed by my guests once again with Pete, Allison, Angelo Ross. Guys, I am so glad to have you on. I've been looking forward to this discussion for quite some time. Thank you for taking the time to chat.
Thanks,
Been
Coach.
too long. Yep, been too long, George. Thanks.
We've been emailing back and forth about various topics, and I just had a clinic the other night, and the words we use really came up in I really started thinking about this in a lot of portions of our lessons, including feedback and our introductions and things like that. And Pete, it really was driven home because you and I had a chat about this a number of months ago, actually. And you challenged me and our listeners, if we actually use these techniques in a lesson, it might feel a little uncomfortable at first. But it really might make for a much better lesson if we're aware of the things we're saying. And I took that to heart when I actually met this clinic last Thursday night, and we'll kind of go from there. But how do you feel about how we're doing with our class introductions, Angelo? I think that's such an important part of our lesson that we can easily slip into old habits, or I can just get to meet everybody real quick, but we don't really use it as a fact-finding time that's meaningful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get it. I agree. I think we do a really good job of the whole introduction and eye contact and where you're from, that we do a really good job with that. And I'm generalizing and just, talking across the country, but I think sometimes it ends there, and in terms of checking back in with goals and things like that throughout the lesson, and which then, inhibits our ability to adjust a lesson appropriately as it's happening. But another thing that we probably do habitually is use jargon without introducing it. I think we could, I feel pretty safe saying we could do a better job at that. And even having the conversation with ourselves as we're meeting these folks, do we need to introduce jargon in the first place? I mean, certainly if it's kids, do we need to do that? And maybe we hook them earlier by not doing that, then introduce it more, pepper it throughout. Maybe that's an approach, but I feel like we could get better at that. I know I certainly could.
Well, Angelo, aren't we going to get better tips and things if a 3-year-old goes up to his or her parents and says, I learned angulation today?
3-year-old has a trust fund, maybe, yeah.
One of the things you bring up jargon or our language, and I don't want to offend or anything here, but which means I guess I'm going to be offensive. But I hear jargon a lot, not necessarily used correctly, and I wonder if, as trainers and ski and ride school leaders, if we're using those terms and maybe not really making certain that the people that we're working with understand it too, because I've been in a number of situations where I hear those terms come out and we're prepping for an exam. And when I hear them, I'm always like, oh, well, how does pressure work in this instance? And some people define it great. Other people, you almost get the feeling like they've heard the term, but really don't know what it means or how to use it in a fitting manner. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense to me, and I want to speak for Pete, but I agree. I think it was Feynman, or at least it's attributed to Feynman. He said it, to know the name of something is to know essentially nothing about it, and there's a I believe it's real that when you put yourself out there and you say, look, I'm going to be a teacher of something. I'm going to be an instructor of this or that. And, for us, of course, it's snow sports. There's a responsibility on the part of new teachers to invest some energy in learning the language of the sport. It's part of the craft. It's part of the culture. And so I totally 100% hear you and agree that as leader, like when I was in snow sports school leadership at my home hill and I was the training manager, I'm sure I could have done a better job, introducing terminology, jargon to our new people systematically over a couple of years. I know I could have done a better job at that. The flip side is there's a responsibility of folks who teach to invest some energy too. So I feel like, we could probably all get better at it.
It was funny for me, and Pete, getting back to your challenge at introduction, I was starting a level one preparation training the other night, and I was asking people why they were taking the clinic. And people listed off some reasons. Yeah, I want to do this and I'm getting ready for an exam. Why do you want to take the exam? What do you want to get out of the exam? I want to become a better teacher. I want to become a better skier. And I said, well, couldn't you read a book? And, and the response kind of was a taken aback look. And I was like, don't be too much of a jerk, but I really want to use this as a learning experience. And I stepped back and I said, well, Pete, what do you mean by a better teacher? And what do you need to do to become a better skier? Because that told me nothing. And again, people were kind of like, and we're getting ready to start. So when we were on the chair and had done a couple of the demos, I said, now, how would you feel if I said, wow, Pete, you did that so much better than the first time? What did I just tell you? And when the realization of what we had done earlier really got driven home by, oh, we need to be much more specific and clear in the feedback that we're getting during those introductions, as well as when we're giving feedback. And the clinic just changed. It was amazing. We had a ball. The mountain was shut down because of high winds. We're stuck on the one beginner chair that was running, and 6 guys doing wedge turns and level 1 maneuvers. And that 2 hours went by so fast. It was a blast, and it was fun to have taken your challenge, Pete, and put it into use, and it actually worked.
Amazing how that happens, George. I
Yes, thank you.
listening to you makes me want to get on a plane and come and observe some of your clinics and watch what's going on, because it just sounds great. I love hearing about it, George, and it sounds like you're really experimenting with with language and trying to get people engaged, which I know when I teach a lesson, at the start, in that first kind of 5 minutes, there's so much going on, and how much people can actually take in and how much we can take in, I think, is something that we often overestimate. I did some, I was, you reminded me, I was playing with this a couple of years ago with, we were running some workshops, and AJ Oliver, who's now on the team from Big Sky, was there, and him and I were talking about this, and we had the group, and we asked people to, you could give a minute of feedback to people. So, and after that minute, we just stopped the conversation. And then we asked people, how much of that did you take in? And it was about a third of it. And so, I was kind of struck by, and I know this isn't introductions, but it's just that kind of idea that if we think we've got so many great things to tell people that they're going to take everything in, if we talk at them for a minute and they take in about a third of it, we've really got a lot of work to do. We should keep things short, and George, I've said this 100 times. I'm a big fan of the KISS principle. Keep it simple. And I think there's a lot to that, and you got me kind of spinning on a couple of different orbits here. So one of the orbits is thinking about the standards, and one of the things that we did when in developing the standards was worked on vocabulary and just trying to have one vocabulary across the association in the standards and in the assessment forms, in the performance guides, throughout all of the documentation, was to have one consistent vocabulary. And a lot of people spent a lot of time on trying to have that consistent vocabulary. And so I think there's a lot to be said for that. And then the other thing that kind of you made me think about was, a long time ago, I used to teach climbing, and in those climbing sessions, a lot of that was first-time climbers at either indoor climbing walls or rock gyms or climbing gyms, whatever you want to call them, or at single pitch crags, just beginner climbing. And what I realized was that we weren't actually teaching people climbing, we were teaching people climbing language. And so we're teaching people about ropes, and we're teaching people about carabiners, and we're teaching people about knots. And it was just this barrage of language, you know, and we weren't teaching climbing at all. We were teaching rope work. And I just wonder, I can see Angelo kind of smiling, and I just think, to me, there's got to be some kind of similarities there, right? We kind of have all this language that we love to use, and we do it because it's, you know, in climbing it's sexy, right? Or we love to, you know, talk about all that stuff. It kind of it's somehow sexy or attractive stuff, and it kind of makes us an in-group. I'm going to stop because I can see Angelo's got so many.
I'm chuckling because I used to teach some climbing too, and it reminded me the first thing I would teach, in quotes, air quotes, is remind folks that you're a primate. So like climbing is part of the packaging. There's a bit of an arrogance to think we can teach somebody how to climb. We've been climbing since we crawled out of the mud. But yeah, I mean, I agree, Pete. We teach them the extraneous stuff, the safety, the knots, the language, right? But the climbing itself, there's definitely some technique, but man, just climb. Just start climbing. Skiing's a little more challenging, right? We haven't been skiing since we crawled out of the mud.
But there's still a lot in that, right? There's still a lot of, oh, this is a binding, okay, this is a boot. How do you put it in there? Oh, you've got to make sure that bit's down and not up in order for it to work, to attach your boot. And you know, we've got the tip of the ski, and we've got edges, and we've got pressure, and you know, there's a lot of those things going on for, you know, and for a lot of the public, that's not everyday language.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. And they're there with a 5-pound weight on each foot if they're learning how to ski. Actually more if the skis are then on. They're very nervous. There are all sorts of things going on. I mean, I really feel like we're there to help them relax more than anything, and be aware of their surroundings so that no one gets hurt.
Sorry, George, I feel like I've taken us off on a bit of a tangent. I know that probably wasn't your plan, George. You wanted to talk about the introduction and how we get people, but
but this is all part of it.
Right. It's that, you know, how we do that.
But I think that, no, I think there's some connection there, because you're talking about framing the setting, framing the environment, and we have to also frame the language, you know, and we started out and feedback came up early, but we may as well dissect that a little bit. Like, I believe, I advocate for, as you're meeting these folks for the first time and figuring out their goals and figuring out what they want to work on, a teacher with depth and breadth can begin to frame the feedback possibilities for what may occur by the end of that session, whether it's a couple hours or it's a day or a week or whatever. They're giving you clues on where you might head, you know, just like as a simple example, if somebody comes to ski with you for the day and they're like, I want, or snowboard, and you say, I want to get better at bumps, you know, we've all seen enough skiing and snowboarding that we have some ideas what the common inefficiencies might be. So if we can start to frame where that lesson may go, this is not written in stone. If we can start to frame that from the beginning, well, maybe they're gonna need a little more work with turning the legs under the upper body, keeping the skis flatter. Maybe they're gonna need work bending or unbending. So this could go in a rotary direction. It could go in a pressure management direction. It might totally go in another one, but at least you're starting to frame the concept for yourself so you can stay on more of a clear path. But knowing where that might lead, then as these folks start to have success, which they may not even be able to identify that success, because when you start to change movement patterns, even though it's a more efficient movement, it probably you don't feel like it doesn't feel as efficient as your previous movement, because that takes time to wire in. But as you start heading down this pathway and see it starting to take shape, you start to frame where your feedback's going to go, so you can look for those moments that allow them to self-coach. And it's like those, oh, that felt really great, perfect. Let's do that again. And practice a couple of times and get them to the point where they can start to associate that performance change with what you're observing get them to associate that performance change you're observing with something internal they can feel, and they can chase that feeling. When the lesson ends, they can begin to self-coach. But that whole convoluted story is to get to the point where, if you know that from the beginning and you're framing that and starting to use that language throughout the lesson, when you get to the end, the feedback becomes really, really meaningful. And I know that's something we wanted to talk about tonight, because then it's individualized, it's specific to, I'm looking at Pete now. So if I'm skiing bumps with Pete, and it's like, he's like, oh man, I feel this thing in my abs that I've never felt before. Great. That becomes Pete's homework as he leaves to practice before he comes back a couple weeks later to check back in to see how it's going. But that all leads to using that language specifically to give him what he bought and why he showed up in the beginning of the day.
And that's where I think we can go even further in depth and say, Pete, why do you want to get better in bumps? And then you learn that maybe Pete had a really bad accident in the bumps and he's got a lot of fear there built up. And you can find out even more things about that person and deliver that personalized lesson, because you've taken the time to really find out about them and what they want to get out of skiing or snowboarding.
Yeah, and I can attest that that's, Angelo's talking about a real story there. That's not made up, that, and I think it's easy to overlook that. In some ways, teaching snow sports is about helping people to experience new feelings and then think about recreating them. So for me, there are moments that when I ski bumps now, I think about engaging my core way more than that's my focus. And so I go back to the time Angelo and I were skiing the bumps and he said, hey, try this. And it made all the difference for me. And so now it's just, okay, I've just got to recreate that feeling and everything flows from it. But that was because Angelo watched, saw, and he spotted, and he went, okay, that's what you need. This'll make the difference. And it did, and it continues to do as well. But I think that's also, to go back to language, it's about having the right language that spoke to me, and obviously we speak two different languages. I speak, real English, and you speak a version of it.
I speak Yinzer, being from Pittsburgh. It's a very specific dialect.
Sorry, George, I don't mean to offend all the listeners.
But to George's point, though, too, like the whole, so there's a technical aspect of being efficient with language, right? Like if the words and that just kind of happened accidentally, Pete. I wasn't intending to talk about that when we were skiing in Big Sky, but I looked at you, there you were. That reminded me. But there's a technical component to the language we use. If I had said words that confused Pete, and especially we do have a minor language barrier. Pete and I, we use different words for different things. flashlight and torch, I mean, just as an example. So if I use a word that Pete grew up using differently, it could have totally muddied the water. So there's a technical element to having precise language. But then there, to your point, George, you brought it up, the whole trust thing, or if you don't build trust with language, or if you break trust with your language, chances of those folks learning are diminished right from that point. And you know how hard that is to get that back.
I mean, every time Pete says crikey, I'm like,
I can sprinkle it in whenever you want me to. Don't worry, I can do that.
I always love it. So how do we get efficient with our language? And yeah, you hear so many jokes or things about instructors love to hear themselves talk. And it's like, I think we do because we're excited about what we're saying and we're excited to be out teaching. But when I ask someone to give a teaching example and then, okay, now I want you to do that in 2 sentences, or I want you to take that from a minute to 20 seconds. It can be done, but why does that become such a task? Why is that difficult to do? Because we know what we're talking about. We should be able to say it simply, but it can be very difficult to say it simply.
I mean, I'll have a vague first shot at that, George. I think it's about listening. I think it's about listening to the people that you're with, whoever you're teaching, and trying to use language that works for them. Especially when we're talking about the public. Now, in an assessment or in a training that's for an assessment, and part of that is about learning the language and being part of the association. Some of that is about teaching people the language that we use in the association. But in my mind, when we're talking to the public, we want to listen and try and pick up the kind of language that they're using and then translate what we want them to think about doing into something that makes sense for them. And so, knowing, if you have a group of people, say if you've got a group of PE teachers, you might use different language to if you've got a group of engineers as if you've got a group of artists, or or different metaphors and analogies. And English, whether that's American English or British English, is a very metaphorical language. We speak in metaphors a lot, and so thinking about metaphors that work for them and language that works for them, I think, is really important. And my view is that the way you pick that up is through listening to their conversation. Sometimes it means sitting quietly on the chair and just listening to what they're saying and what they're talking about.
Angelo, Pete, this question is to both of you because I know when I'm training, I really say if you can keep it very simple, but you're correct in what you're saying, you're going to impress your examiner because you kept it simple. You didn't use words that, could be confusing, and it was clear, well done, and we're moving forward and everyone's having fun. How do you want to see someone deliver a lesson when they're going for a level 1, level 2, level 3? And is there a difference in the words we use at those levels?
I was just wondering if I ever used the word angulation before I became a snow sports instructor, and I feel pretty safe saying no, but it's a technical term in our culture, so I think this touches a little bit on your last question that Pete responded to also. I fully agree that we have to adjust our language, particularly with the public, right? Because, and you have to look at who are you working with? Is it 4-year-olds, 64-year-olds, what interests, all of that stuff. So we need to have synonyms. We need to have synonyms on lock so that if we do happen to use a word that doesn't work, like what's your plan B? What's your plan C? What's your plan F? If those words aren't those words aren't working. I work quite a bit with National Ski Patrol. I'm a member. I'm a toboggan instructor. I work with our local folks and folks all throughout the East. And it's really interesting working with ski patrollers because they are also on snow professionals. And they're very, very tuned in with the language that they use. But when it comes to technical performance, the language they use often isn't the language we use. And so a good chunk of the conversation, especially at the beginning, maybe the first morning, is just trying to make sure you're on common ground. When I use a word, I want to make sure they know what it means and vice versa. So there's that. But to get to your last question, George, I honestly think, command of the language requires some work. Like as a snow sports instructor, I believe if you're planning to do this and get good at it, you have to study. You have to practice. There's got to be effort. There's going to be sweat. You have to use those words and you have to test them out in different situations. And if that means what that means is clinicking with other pros and to make sure that the way you're using the words or the way you're understanding the words fit within the meaning. Read the glossary of the manuals, make flashcards on 3x5 cards, practice them when you're, washing the dishes or whatever, standing there, you have 5 minutes to kill, pull them out and flip through them. That's what we did. But to your question about in exams, I'm not terribly concerned if I hear every technical term in the book. What I do want to hear though, or what I do want to observe is that the words that an exam candidate uses connect with something. Like they need to connect with the concept. They need to connect with a movement, and that movement needs to connect with making the performance better, the skiing or the snowboarding performance. That's what's important. It's not about the jargon. But since we understand it, we can use it efficiently and get through that little pathway more quickly. But in an exam, like we have an expectation that we're going to ask questions. And if those questions are going to be effective, and this is no different than in a lesson, I just happen to be in a certification exam, but what you're trying to do is come to a common understanding. If I have to ask a few questions so that I make sure I understand what an exam candidate means, that's great. That's on me as the examiner. That's part of the job. But what I'm looking for specifically is, does that word connect with some particular movement that you're trying to get your peers in this group to do? And is it making the tool use more efficient? Are they using the ski or the snowboard more efficiently because of the words you used to get to that movement? And then it's ski snow interaction at that point. But I'm not personally that concerned about doing a vocabulary exam on that side of the hill. It's more about, are we seeing you move this group toward meaningful change? That's what we examine.
Just talking about jargon got me thinking about work. And anytime I have technical issues with the computer, and I'm hearing a lot of feedback right now. Technical issues with the computer, I guess. And you call up tech and they start just jargoning like crazy. And I don't understand any of the letters they're using, and to already be feeling stupid because I'm having this issue in the first place, and then having the person that is the expert make me feel even worse. I would never want to do that to a guest at the ski resort who's taking a lesson or someone who came in for a clinic. I want them to feel uplifted and feel good about what we're doing. And it's I don't know, being in those situations at work it's so frustrating, but it's also, I think, a very good learning opportunity for what we do.
So I'm struck as you're talking, Angelo. I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think, there are no shortcuts. Like, people think they can somehow learn this stuff quickly or sneak through. It just doesn't work that way. When you go for an assessment, if you've been teaching, you've spent time doing that, if you've read the manuals, if you've grasped that stuff and you have a reasonably deep understanding of it, it shows. There's no fooling. It's a bit like, when children think that they can lie to adults and they think they can get away with it, and adults can just see straight through it. It's the same kind of thing as that. You can spot, when somebody knows what they're talking about. And it's often because they can move people through that sequence quickly, not necessarily using the language. Often in assessment, it is using the language because people are teaching peers, but that experience and the knowledge shows. You can see it. It doesn't take within the first 5 minutes, you can spot it. It's happening straight away or not. And so I just think there is, we live in a world where people are always trying to do things faster, shorter, quicker, kind of move through. There is no shortcut to experience, and there's no shortcut to study. I don't, whatever AI tells you, that's all very, very good, but it doesn't mean you know it. To use a current kind of example. And I know that probably sounds very old fashioned, but I do believe, quality, if you want to be good at something, you've got to put in the work.
And so short and fast.
Grumpy.
Go ahead, Angelo.
It just made me think as Pete was saying that, like I'm picturing myself conducting an exam, and we haven't talked about body language, which is, we've all read the facts and figures, maybe even a bigger influence on what people are receiving from us as we communicate with them. But if I don't need to hear flexion and extension as terminology in an exam, if somebody says bend and unbend and shows me the move, like just as good, if not better. You know what I mean? Like the body language the body language augments the words, but it's really what we're trying to get at is, do you understand the sport? And can you help coach these people to a performance change? That's really what's important. But I think jargon gets a lot of shine because it's such an important part of our culture. And as a new instructor, when you start to use the words and people are reacting to them appropriately, but especially in my case, like the people I wanted to earn their respect on my Snowsports school when I was a young instructor, when they started to react positively to the things I said when I was talking about skiing, like it just made me feel part of that club, part of that culture. There's a lot of appeal to that, but I'm sure there are a lot of years where I was using those terms, not maybe, and certainly not with the depth that I understand them now. But to Pete's point, that took 35 years, of work.
Well, I think we're scratching the surface on a topic that we could talk for hours on and really get a lot out of this. I appreciate you guys taking the time to chat about this because it's a topic I'd like to continue to revisit throughout the season.
George, at the risk of, I know we're kind of wrapping up in, and I know I probably sounded really grumpy, like a grumpy old man there, what I was saying. But I guess, what I would say, what I think about this is just being conscious of the language we use and making more and more deliberate choices, reflecting on it and thinking about it as well when we're in everyday life, all the time. What are people saying that we're misconstruing or misunderstanding? Or what are we saying that other people are misconstruing or misunderstanding? And just being hopefully more sensitive and thoughtful towards that and making deliberate choices.
Pete, isn't the technical term for a grumpy old man a geezer? Use the jargon.
A geezer.
What is it in British English, Pete?
Well, in the south you'd be a geezer. In the north you'd be a gadgie. or in Scotland it'd be a gadgie. All right, gadgie. And
Tell me how to spell that, and I'm making a shirt for myself.
there's a whole lot more vocabulary as well. I'll need to kind of just trigger some synapses to get some of that vocabulary back on what a grumpy person is. But geezer or grumpy old geezer, gadgie, they're good, definitely a good couple to start with.
All right,
those synonyms are great though, and he's been just to nail it, to drive it home, to put the nail in it. He's been practicing his vocabulary for over 50 years. That's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears there.
Well, my fellow gadgies, Pete Allison and Angelo Ross, thanks very much for joining us for the discussion from the PSIA-AASI Satellite Studios in Corvallis, Oregon. I'm George Thomas.